One of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is just the fact that none of us really expected to be quarantined for or socially distanced or whatever we call what we're still doing now in 2020. But one outcome of this is that more and more people are doing business online, and that makes it increasingly important to shore up our online authentication. So I'm going to be sharing what I think are some good options for designing specifically account recovery when users have two-factor authentication enabled. And I specifically call out customer account recovery here because I think there's a difference between thinking about this problem for consumer-facing applications compared to something like an internal employee or enterprise account recovery. If you saw one of the talks earlier, Philippe talked about this when it came to, enterprise authentication. If you have, even 10,000 employees, you can probably have a internal security hotline that those employees can call when they need to be resetting passwords or anything like that. So the use case for something like that is a lot different than the consumer account recovery path. So I'm going to be focusing on consumer applications and end user security. So my name is Kelley Robinson. I've been working at Twilio for a little over 3 years now. I do specifically support Twilio's account security products. Twilio does a lot of things now, but I work on things like user verification, phone verification, email verification. And this team has evolved a lot since we acquired Authy 5 years ago. And Authy is our free consumer application for two-factor authentication, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But this talk is going to incorporate a lot of the things that I've learned over the last few years working with developers and our customers on their authentication challenges, and also some of the things that we've learned running a two-factor authentication product that has an account recovery option. I also want to call out Twilio just acquired Segment. The deal closed this week, and so while I can take zero credit for anything that the team over there does, I do want to thank all of the hard work from people like Leaf for organizing the conference, also the rest of the LocoMocoSec organizing team, also Colleen, who spoke this morning. I'm really excited that I get to be coworkers with both of you now. I'm excited to work with you in whatever capacity that ends up being. So welcome Segment, and thank you for sponsoring LocoMocoSec. So, of course, we hope that users don't lock themselves out of their accounts, but there's a lot of common reasons that we have to take into account when we're designing these systems, right? Like life happens, people forget their passwords. That's a very common one with a lot of consumer-facing systems. People change their phone numbers. They lose their phones. They lose their security keys or whatever authenticator they're using. They upgrade to the latest iPhone and forget that there was something important like, a Google Authenticator app on their old device before they move everything over. And we have to figure out how to address these issues while still guarding against attackers and account takeover attempts. So let's start by just basically defining what account recovery is. And it's risky because you're not just authenticating, you're also reproving an identity, and you're reproving it to an account that already is going to have value or data associated with that. It doesn't come with a clean slate. So it likely has, data or money attached to it, and that's going to come with some increased risk. I do really like how Mark Lovelace characterizes account recovery as an alternative authentication system. We can't necessarily think of it as the same one that we're using to log people into the website on an ongoing basis, because this is a separate path, assuming that a user has lost one of their authentication factors. And because there are all these risks associated with account recovery, addressing this can be really expensive. People cannot decide exactly how much this costs, but they know that it's like anywhere between $40 and $70 for an account recovery support call if you're calling into some kind of call center. I have citations and slides for this if you want to look at some of the research that's been done on this. But the basic idea here is that this is expensive, and you want to make sure that people have a route to do this that can hopefully lower some of that expense or lower some of the burden on your support team. And the first thing that I wanted to take into account was the different factors that we have access to and that we're giving our users access to, and how we can evaluate these factors for account recovery. One thing to note is that the more of these factors that you collect when the user first signs up, when they have that clean slate, the more that you'll have to trust and verify against when they attempt an account recovery later. And that's even if they're not using any one of these factors on an ongoing basis. You might not be using a possession factor every time a user logs in. But if it's associated with their account and they lose another one of the factors that they do use on an ongoing basis, you can always go back to that backup factor. Let's start looking at knowledge factors, or things that you know. These could be passwords, everyone's favorite, security questions, even more favorite, specific account information. This could be recent transactions or other hopefully secret details about the account. Knowledge factors are really great because they're easy to use and to set up, and they can't be lost. The reason that security questions are so popular as an account recovery mechanism is because things like your mother's maiden name or your first pets don't really change, and you might remember those details more than you would a password or some kind of backup PIN. However, of course, as we all know here, passwords can be breached. People reuse passwords across multiple sites, and many security questions don't, or account details, like those are things that might be able to be searched or Googled or found out in any kind of social engineering attack or something like that. It's not impossible to find the street that someone grew up on or guess the color of their first car. And of course, humans are forgetful. So one of the big things that we have to think about here is that anything like a password can be just forgotten or lost that way. Next, inherence factors, or things that you are, like fingerprints, your voice, or even the way that you type. These are another way to identify you. Benefits is that you can't lose or forget these, but the downside, obviously, is that you can't really change these. So the risk is really high for these getting breached, which makes implementation of these delicate, and a big reason that these aren't as widely supported outside of on-device authentication. There's, been different talks about things like how you can clone fingerprints and that kind of thing. It's all a little like sci-fi, but these types of things are possible. So, your mileage may vary with how much you're going to trust these types of factors. Obviously, there's a lot of good use cases for these that devices are making more possible these days. So definitely work with inherence factors when they make sense for your use case, especially if you have any kind of mobile application. Finally, possession factors are something that you have tend to be more secure than passwords because they can be harder to phish and don't get leaked in data breaches. And these could include things like your phone, backup or recovery codes, or hardware security tokens like YubiKeys. Of course, when it comes to something that you have, people do tend to lose and replace these things, which means that these aren't hard to guarantee for account recovery. Possession also introduces additional friction to set something up compared to something that you know or something that you are. And so if somebody is asking you to use a YubiKey or use an authenticator app like Google Authenticator or Authy, that's going to require some initial setup from the person. And so that's always something that might be harder to ensure that all of your users have enabled. I want to go on a really quick rant and highlight one type of possession factor that we see a lot for account recovery, which is backup tokens or recovery codes. And recovery tokens or backup codes are given to you, so they're more likely to be longer and less likely to be reused. However, this means that people have to store backup codes somewhere. And while some sites give you explicit options, they'll say things like write them down or save them in a password manager. Email to them to yourself isn't the worst option in my opinion. This screenshot from Instagram is a real example that does not give you any useful guidance. And while I haven't actually found any research on this, if anybody has research on this, please let me know. My hypothesis is that most people don't actually save these, so they become somewhat useless form of recovery. And so, there's debatable solutions here. You could email the recovery codes automatically to the user. Of course, if they lose access to their email, they're locked out. And if someone gets into their email, they're also screwed. But is that any better or worse than those of us who store these in our password managers? I'm not saying you should do this, but I am saying it might have higher usability than whatever some people are doing today. And so this is just one example of the types of factors that we have to take into account and the pros and cons with these methods that we're going to be considering as I talk through some of our other recovery examples. Going to spend a little bit of time looking at a few companies and their account recovery processes. This is from a vague collection of either things that I have personally gone through with account recovery, things that have good documentation about their account recovery process. And of course, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how Authy does our own account recovery for our two-factor authentication users. A lot of companies are intentionally vague about this, and it's not necessarily going to be the same for every user. But I was able to find documentation, and obviously from personal experience and research here, about how some of these companies work. So I wanted to start with a somewhat questionable example. E-Trade not only has this really weird form of two-factor authentication, they basically have you append the 2FA code to your password, which I don't love, but it also forces you to reset your 2FA over the phone if and when you change phones. The two-factor authentication app that they use is proprietary, so even though a lot of authenticator apps use an open source TOTP standard, you can't do that with this form of 2FA. They have a proprietary app that you need to use. So I can't use, Authy or whatever app I want to be using for my other TOTP codes. And the really unfortunate thing about this is the only way to reset your code when you do this is to call their call center. And when you do that, they basically require no authentication to change 2FA. So this is kind of the worst of both worlds. It's not self-service online, but even when you call into their call center, it's not even that secure. I've talked a lot in the past about call center security, and there's definitely things that you can do to improve that experience. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I think E-Trade has a lot of opportunity there to improve their experience for the two-factor authentication recovery. Next, let's look at Authy. We're one of the people that's intentionally vague about how we do some of this, but we basically require two-factor authentication for any kind of account recovery. So if you lose one of your factors, we make sure that we have registered additional factors when you create an account with us, so that you still need 2FA in order to regain access to the account. If users still have access to some of their factors, like a password, a sync device, their mobile number, the process is a lot smoother. We do also enforce a waiting period that can range between 1 and 4 days, depending on which factors that you still have access to. And in that time, we do a lot of things like we'll email you and let you know that somebody has requested an account recovery. So if somebody is trying to take over your account, hopefully you still have access to your email address and we'll see those notifications. If the user doesn't have access to more important factors like the phone number that is tied to your Authy account, we do have additional requirements to allow people to change their phone number and regain access to the account. Especially outside of the US, changing phone numbers is somewhat of a common process. And so this is something that we had to take into account when designing our product. And of course, users might be annoyed at some of these restrictions, like 4 days, if this is blocking a Twitch streamer from getting into their account, that can be really frustrating for some of our users. But people are more understanding of the additional friction when it comes to security products. And so because this is a security product, we know that we can get away with having these additional restrictions. To use the example from earlier, if this was like a cooking blog, this is not necessarily going to be the right strategy for doing authentication and account recovery for your users if the thing that you're securing isn't as risky. Next, I'm going to talk about GitHub. GitHub has really extensive documentation about their 2FA recovery process, and they also offer a lot of different options for recovering your account. One option is recovery tokens, so I highly suggest that everybody watching this has their GitHub recovery tokens saved somewhere, because that is one of the easiest ways to recover your GitHub account if you lose access to your second factor, or either of your factors, actually. They will also allow you to fall back to SMS if you have a stronger form of 2FA enabled, like TOTP or YubiKeys. You can disable that if you want. They do an interesting thing too, where you can actually configure your Facebook account to store a recovery token, which has the downside of requiring that you have a Facebook account, but the upside that you're likely to be able to access Facebook even if you lose access to GitHub. A friend of mine went through this process, the account recovery process, after they lost their authenticator tokens. And they said, in line with the warning shown here, that GitHub told them they could unlink my email address so I could use it again to create a new account, fork all of my stuff, and then in 6 months, if my old username is still dormant, they would release it to me. So that's a pretty extreme and unforgiving account recovery scenario. Like 6 months is a long time, but I don't know if that's true for all users, or maybe my friend's account was high risk or in some kind of bucket, or at the time they were going through additional protocols there. But definitely make sure that you have some recovery options configured for your GitHub account. And like, think about the risk profile of a company like GitHub. They have higher risk users there, because if you have access to certain types of source code, that could be a good way to do other types of account takeover. So they want to be especially careful there. But speaking of Facebook, one option for account recovery at Facebook is somewhat unique, or at least tied to the features of that product. So what they do is they allow you to nominate 3 to 5 friends that can confirm your identity before giving your account back to you. And this is a really cool idea if your product has any kind of social component like Facebook, or if you have a product that has any kind of like team-based aspect, if your coworkers can verify your account, if you're using some kind of like B2B software like that, that could be a reasonable solution for you. Getting users to set this up might be challenging. I'm not really a Facebook user, but I had to dig into profile settings to find this, which most people aren't going to do. And maybe that's something that if I was a heavier Facebook user, they would have prompted me about this. Or maybe if I didn't already have other forms of two-factor authentication enabled on my account, they might have prompted me for this. I don't totally know, but one of the things that you have to think about is how you are going to encourage your users to set up authentication factors for account recovery. And so those are just some examples of what different companies are currently doing. Now I want to go through some of my recommendations, what you can do for your company. First, the easiest thing, the most straightforward recommendation of all of this is that you want to have your users register more factors than they need for everyday login. So for account recovery for 2FA, you need 3FA essentially. You don't necessarily need to have all 3 types of factors, but you want to have at least 2 different methods within, the possession factor category or something like that. The big benefit of this is that you'll have additional trusted factors to compare when the user loses one of their main login factors. The more factors that you have to verify against, the more confident that you can be that it's at least the right person trying to gain access to their account, and the higher chance that a user will still have at least 2 factors. You could register these at signup, or it could be during a different authenticated session. So you might not want to make people register 3 or 4 or 5 factors when you go through the signup process. If you work with a growth team, they might be a little angry about that process. That's going to create some overhead, but it is justifiable in certain use cases. So ING Bank now supports virtual video calls to verify new customers, but an internet retailer probably shouldn't be asking a user to upload a government ID. One other thing that you want to make sure is that you are doing some threat modeling, looking at your ATO costs and understanding how much that you're actually losing in this process. You want to make sure that you're making the right level of investment for your business. If you're in a higher value industry like financial services, this could mean adding more friction to your recovery process, but make sure you consider this from your customer's perspective too. Do they understand the value of their account? A user that's signing up for a company like Gemini, which is a cryptocurrency exchange, probably is willing to opt into more security measures than they would for like their DoorDash account. I love this quote from one of my favorite security researchers named Cormac Hurley from a great paper that he released back in 2016 that argues that users they reject a lot of security advice for good reasons because following that advice takes more time than they might risk losing. I was surveying some of my security friends about what they think of backup codes a while back, and one guy outlined the detailed folder structure on the USB drive that he keeps in a locked safe. And I was just like, wow, I'm like really glad that works for you, but I don't think that's worth it. And, I'm somebody that's like in a, security profession that thinks about this stuff a lot of times. So how could I recommend that to a lot of people? You have to be conscious of like who you're working with and how much you want to make them paranoid about the types of recovery and security that they want to be considering. So getting back to more recommendations, along the lines of looking at your threat model, you do want to be intentional about where you're going to allow your staff to facilitate account recovery. This was from a conversation I had in Twitter DMs, where I was able to get the customer support to reset my account just by giving them my phone number and email. My Twitter account is my full name, but it's not connected to this profile. And I'm not saying that this company shouldn't let their support team do this, but this was sensitive enough that when I was making this slide, I was like, I don't really want to tell you who this company is. I'm also going to be a little bit more paranoid than the average person, but from a service perspective, this was really easy to deal with. So it's all about evaluating those trade-offs. Another thing that you can do, and so I talked about this, you might not want to always require users register additional factors at sign up, but you can prompt users to confirm account recovery when they log in. That could be used for a recovery when they lose their account. And so this is one way that GitHub does that. This is the same idea behind things like security checkups and email notifications to review your account. These types of reminders are relatively cheap and easy to implement, especially compared to the cost of a customer lockout or account recovery. So definitely something that you might want to consider when thinking about your account recovery setup. And more than general prompts, you can also time these reminders around the holidays or new iPhone releases, both of which are coming up when a lot of people are going to be changing their phone. And so this is something that if you support TOTP, if you support some kind of two-factor authentication that's tied to a user's phone, you might want to be thinking about this, sending some kind of email notification to say, hey, you might be changing your phone coming up. This is the one way that Zapier did it for me last year. And so remember to save your recovery code so you don't get locked out of your account, or whatever method that you have, update some information on your account so you have a backup method. Authy used to be one of the only authenticator apps that supported backup codes, and that was one of the reasons it got really popular. This might not be as big of a problem now that a lot of other TOTP apps have a backup feature. Even Google Authenticator just rolled out a token export feature for Android. But that still requires that the person does some work to export those codes. And not everybody is going to do that automatically. So hopefully you're already doing this, but oh no, I lost the image on this page. So I'll share these slides later with that provided. But designing your 2FA onboarding really well is also really important. So according to a 2018 study here that focused on the usability of YubiKeys, what this was going to show was basically they looked at how easy it was to set up YubiKeys on 3 different services. So they looked at Google, they looked at Facebook, and they looked at Windows 10 login. And there was a lot of different varied levels of success between the 3 platforms. The thing that they all had in common is they were all testing to see you were setting up a YubiKey on the platform. So Google had 83% success with customers being able to set a YubiKey up successfully. Facebook had 32% success able to set it up successfully. But 19% of people locked themselves out of their Windows 10 account because the system allowed them to enable the factor without ever doing a successful verification. And one of the things that I think is important to note with a lot of this stuff is that a lot has changed since 2018. We're well beyond what we were doing with YubiKeys 2 years ago at this point. But onboarding user experience is going to be really critical to your user's success. It might sound obvious, but make sure that users can successfully complete one authentication with their factor before you turn it on. Make sure that they have set it up correctly so that there's, make sure that the keys are in sync and everything like that. And make sure that you're providing good documentation and a good workflow for that process so that users are equipped and ready to use that factor on an ongoing basis. And finally, add waiting periods. If you are really worried about potential account takeovers with this type of stuff, waiting periods can deter hackers and give real users time to dispute takeover attempts. This is, again, one thing that we do with Authy. And remember that your solution will never perfectly prevent attacks, but in most cases, you're trying to build something that will discourage people from trying. The goal here is to slow down an attacker so that you have time to respond and protect legitimate users. Here's a GitHub notification about how their account recovery process may take 3 to 5 business days. This is something that I think is pretty reasonable for something like GitHub. Gemini enforces waiting periods just for a password reset. Again, this is something that they're protecting a lot of value, so this additional friction is probably justified and understood by their users. I did mostly want to focus on the positives here, but I have a couple of things that you shouldn't do. Don't, for instance, let people only use one factor to regain access to their accounts when they have 2FA enabled. We saw a wave of accounts get hacked because they were protected with a password and SMS-based 2FA, and attackers were able to SIM swap and bypass the password because they had the second factor. And so that's something that you probably don't want to allow. Even if somebody forgets their password, make them use at least the second factor that they already have and an additional backup factor. Again, you still want to protect the account with 2 factors. And also, please don't be this company. If you're going to disable the second factor on account recovery, don't offer 2FA is probably my suggestion. At least send a fallback message to an SMS. In this case, for some reason, my password hadn't saved in my password manager, but I had saved the second factor in my authenticator app. And so it was a weird situation because I did have access to one of the factors, and they emailed me their recovery option, like people will do. But then when I got to the page, I was greeted with this message. And I mean, this was probably the thing that inspired me to even give this talk. So I guess thank you for that to this company, but you probably don't want to do this. And finally, don't let any of this discourage you. Don't give up on 2-factor authentication. This Google research shows that even SMS codes help prevent 76% of targeted attacks. And that's really good coverage and can protect a lot of people from account takeover. Just put a little bit of thought into it. I suspect that you will be golden. So I hope I've given you some ideas for how to think about your account recovery processes. If you have any questions, you can find me on Twitter, and I'll stick around for some questions now. Once again, my name is Kelley Robinson, and thank you for listening.
Let's do a little bit of Q&A here. What a fantastic talk, and thank you so much. The first question is, alternative authentication systems are spot on, but how do you build recovery at least as strong as the primary? Like make sure you have independent MFA fallback or something?
Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing that your alternative authentication system might not be as strong as the primary authentication system. And that's a decision that you're going to have to make. One thing that we've seen a lot of people doing is falling back to something like SMS 2FA over TOTP if you lose access to your authenticator app. That's something where I've thought about it, is that really less secure? Should you not even offer TOTP? But I think the process there of having the fallback option is probably going to introduce a little bit more friction in the process than you would have over either having nothing at all or probably a security question. So, I mean, I think that's kind of up to you of which factors you want to register as your alternative authenticators. And some of these might just be things that are just as secure as the everyday login, but maybe a little less usable because you're not going to be asking the person to use it every single time. And so I'm trying to think of examples for that, but, if your normal login process was password and a TOTP authenticator app, and somebody loses access to the authenticator app, maybe they have a backup YubiKey, or they have some kind of in-app authentication that they're doing with a linked application, kind of like the Facebook situation. It's kind of up to you whether or not you think that's just as secure, but I think the idea is probably making sure that all of those are registered to the account before somebody loses that. And so, yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer there, but there's definitely options that you have.
Kelley, the same questioner is also asking, what do you think about registering multiple Authy devices as a potential solution to handle recovery issues?
Yeah, so that's one thing that Authy does offer for people, right? And this is something that like some people like about Authy and some people don't like about Authy. So the idea is that like I can have Authy on both my phone and my iPad, or my phone and like my desktop computer, because we have like an app for both of those things. And so if I lose access to my phone, when I want to go in and add a new device, one thing that we'll say is, hey, like I see that you're trying to add, log into Authy on like your new phone. Like say I'm upgrading my iPhone. Instead of verifying this with a password or a token or something like that, why don't you click approve in the Authy app on your other device? And so that's actually a pretty secure way of making sure that I am who I say I am, assuming that I don't have somebody else that has taken over those devices. For a lot of the consumer applications that use Authy, I think that's a lower risk situation that like our customers have decided is worth the usability trade-off there. And it's definitely something that like I've had, taken into account when I'm in a situation where I need to re-register a device or something like that. It makes it really easy instead of having to go through some kind of account recovery process or entering other authenticators. This key-based authentication type system, one other thing that Philippe talked about earlier, is actually like a pretty secure method of authentication. And so that's something that, if you have access to or users that do use your mobile app, that's definitely something that you could take advantage of, is storing a key on those devices. This is definitely something that companies like Apple do a lot of. If you ever sign into Apple on a new device, like they'll pop up 2FA on an existing device. To verify that. Of course, the downside there, like I mentioned, is if somebody gets access to your device, like if you don't log out of like your Authy account on another device, or somebody steals your iPad or something like that, you might have a problem there. But this is something that like, if somebody steals your device, like they might also have access to your email. And so like, there's always going to be trade-offs with these types of things. And like, part of the hope there is like, we hope that people don't lose their devices. But this is also one of the ways that you can like get around the fact of like, when people do lose their devices. So it's not, none of this is perfect, but we're just trying to like help people as much as we can.
Kelley, thank you again so very much for your time and for being a part of Loco Moco this year.
Thanks for having me, Jim.